It's September 20th, 2019. I'm John Travis in Novato, California, with my dear friend Kent Peterson in Charlottesville, Virginia. And we're going to make some history today. And actually, there is some history being made. It's the global climate strike that was started by Greta Thunberg. And 1.5 million kids around the world supposedly are on the streets. I went into San Rafael this morning to the protest there. So we're making history on another day when history is being made. So welcome, Kent.
Thank you very much.
What we are going to look at today is our history in wellness and the experiences that we recall from mainly the 70s, maybe in the 80s. Beginning when I met you at the Hilton Hotel across from the National Zoo in DC, and I think it was probably August of 78. I was doing a workshop, and you did you come to the workshop, or did you just I give you the book?
Well, this was the first East-West Holistic Health Conference in Washington, sponsored by Effie Poi Yu Chow, who was a nurse PhD. And I was at that time the executive director of the American College of Preventive Medicine, which is a specialty society of doctors who specialize in public health and in aerospace medicine and occupational medicine and undersea medicine. And we were asked to provide continuing medical education, CME credit, for physicians participating in the meeting. So I looked at the program, decided I would take a risk and endorse a meeting to discuss holistic health. And when I looked at the program, I saw your workshop, and I actually, on the second or third day of the conference, did come to your workshop. And you were presenting some fascinating materials, and I met you after your session and asked if I could borrow and take a look at your 3-ring notebook, which you were calling a wellness workbook at that time. Nothing had been published. So I took it home, I looked at it late into the night, and came back the next day, gave it to you, and I think that was really when our friendship began. And how many years ago was that? 51
41.
years? 41 years?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I recall we were at a big table having lunch when I think it's when you gave me the workbook back. We actually sold about 3,000 of those wellness workbooks in the 3-ring binder before 10-speed press picked it up, and it became a mass market. But yeah, you and Marty Albert were both at that workshop, and I think, was Sam there too? Or it seemed to me there were 3 people I met.
There was Alan, can't remember his last name, who was a clinical scholar. I was a clinical scholar at George Washington University, and another one of our scholars was the one who said, "There's somebody I want you to meet." And for 3 days, he kept telling me he wanted to bring me together with this other person, and didn't tell me his name. And finally, on the last day, he introduced me to Marty Albert. Marty had been my classmate at the University of Pennsylvania. We had been good friends for many years and had lost touch with each other. So that was an incredible joy to reconnect with Marty. He had moved to Charlottesville, so we went down and visited him in Charlottesville when they were still looking for a common property to develop into a planned community. And I ended up ultimately buying a lot next door to him in that Moran Forest community. And that led to our eventually moving to Charlottesville. So if it hadn't been for that conference, I would definitely not be living in Charlottesville. I would not have met you. And who knows what I would know about wellness.
Yeah, I'm going to have to interview Effie because I hadn't realized quite how significant. I know I spoke to her students earlier, and that's how we knew each other in San Francisco. But it's becoming even more amazing to me now how important that was of our connection, yours and Marty's connection. Probably Metadocs wouldn't have happened if we hadn't done that, because I met Marty then through you, and we came up with the Metadocs idea at another meeting in Richmond. Amazing stuff. So what happened after that, we were about 2 and 3 years into the Wellness Resource Center's development, and we were doing workshops on preventing burnout in the helping professions. And you came to one, and then I started having you attend as a panelist on Sunday mornings.
We started doing workshops at the Koinonia Retreat Center outside of Baltimore.
Yeah, that's where I
lived.
Yeah.
And that was close to me in Washington. And at one point, I brought my entire staff, all the staff of the American College of Preventive Medicine, to participate in that workshop. Remember that?
Yeah, I've forgotten it until now, but I do definitely remember that. So,
and then after that, you wanted me to start coming as a faculty member and teaching on the second or third day. I don't remember exactly what it was, but you wanted me to talk about the most significant events that had changed my life. And I remember one of them was talking about my relationship with my father. And whenever I did that, I would break down into tears. I just, even to this moment, can't avoid that deep, tender, tearful feeling. And when I did that, apparently everybody around you in the workshop broke down into tears, and that kind of gelled things to go to a deeper level. So I think you brought me back as a prop to
exactly. Because what I recall is that I had a panel of a few people that were professionally credible, because we were struggling. We still had to spell wellness on the phone to people. It was certainly unknown. And, Dan Rather opened his piece a year or so later saying, wellness, there's a word you don't hear every day. And I forgot to turn my phone off.
Well, you just disappeared from video.
Yeah, because this blasted Wi-Fi network plugs my phone into my iPad.
I'm glad you're editing this.
Yeah, we'll snip that piece out. So yes, that was well, and on top of that, you gave us CEUs for these workshops, and
right,
as you had done for Effie, which made it possible for us to get doctors in. In fact, one of the last ones we did, the one that was recorded on 60 Minutes, the medical director for Southern California, Kaiser, came and actually spoke very eloquently. And he wouldn't have come if we didn't have the CEU credits. So that cascaded into a number of other things. And probably the most significant of all of the events, was the deep friendship that we developed and have maintained for 41 years, with a couple of year hiatus in there when things got rough in the early 80s. But this, aspect of wellness that's personal and alive as compared to the wellness industry that they talk about now, the way wellness has been watered down from Halbert Dunn's vision. We really manifested that in our own personal connection and all the other people that we brought together. So I think
well, for me, it was very, very transformational. I was a young physician, still in my 20s, being the executive director of a medical specialty society, a national society, and all of my peers were in their 50s or 60s or 70s. And so I was a sort of a young upstart among the medical specialty societies. And I was passionate about changing the world. I wanted to bring prevention into medicine and to have every specialty think about how to prevent the problems that it was diagnosing and treating. So I was interested not in preventive medicine as a separate and parallel specialty, but one that could integrate the preventive aspects of every illness. I wanted to see preventive surgery and preventive ophthalmology and those kinds of things. So I was also trying to be an advocate. We hired an attorney, and we were doing legislative liaison and trying to influence public policy. We were talking with media writers about public health and prevention. And the Surgeon General during that time published its first report on healthy people, health promotion and disease prevention. So I was looking through my head at the intellectual aspects of championing prevention and getting federal money to pay for residency programs in public health. You came along with this idea of, wait a second, prevention has to apply to each of us as individuals. We need to look at ourselves and what we're doing, how we're living our lives, and how we could improve our health and well-being. And so seeing your book inspired me personally. It changed my life by making me want to be healthy and then to be a role model of health for other people. So it brought it down to really to the grassroots. And I think that's why I was so attracted to you and your message. And clearly our friendship evolved.
Yeah, and just for the record, you were actually 35 in 1978. Now I've given away your age. And I thought you were older than me because you had less hair than I did then. I found out you're 3 months younger than me. That was a shock. But it certainly...
I can't help it if you've always seen me as a father figure.
Yeah, well, you have a lot of fatherly energy. Just another technical thing here that we can edit out, but you're looking down and to the left instead of at the camera. Can you move the picture up on your screen so that you can see me and look? Yeah, way better. Should have done that at the beginning. But anyway, back to our connection, which was profound in both professionally and personally. And you touched me in so many ways. I got feedback, not of all of which I liked with my presentations, because you had a lot of skills with PowerPoint, and well, we were using slide projectors in those days. But you added a level of credibility and nudged me into cleaning up my act to reach a larger audience. And the other aspect of distinction between wellness and prevention, that prevention is always focusing on the negative and not having it happen, whereas Dunn was talking about an expanded sense of self and a zest for life, all that kind of stuff. And there's still that gap. I think wellness has become much more of a preventive focus, and the original intent of Dunn has been lost. But
well, I do believe that the word wellness has become a casual term to describe anything from preventing disease to keeping people healthy. And it's very rarely used to talk about what you just said, namely helping people to live at their peak of joy and balance and flexibility and creativity. And I really understand that that's the far end of the illness wellness continuum. That's what I aspire to in my life. And that's what I don't think wellness programs, even to this day, are truly built around or fostering the way they should.
yeah.
Now, the term well-being has come into parlance in the last couple of years, and that moves closer to the right-hand side of that continuum. But wellness is a term that I see to mean almost anything.
Including dog food, which is the #1 hit when you Google it.
Really?
Yeah, there's a wellness pet food company, and the dog food comes up always on top. There's a half a billion hits now when you Google wellness. The word actually goes back to the 1650s, but it wasn't until Dunn started using high-level wellness and wrote his book back in '61. The aspect I'd like to explore now was what you saw. You knew Bobby and Joy and some of the people that are no longer with us when we did the workshops. And
Right.
you actually did come to the 42 Miller building, didn't you, before we moved out?
Yes, I did.
Okay. What was your sense of that historically?
Well, obviously, you were in a very creative mode to start something new that did not exist. And it seemed like the community of Mill Valley and that street with a certain quiet comfort to it seemed an ideal place for innovation to take place. I wouldn't think of it as a skunk works, but more like a health works. But I understand that you were basically trying on uh, trying on 50 shades of wellness. I saw something yet, heard something yesterday about 50, 50 grays of shade. This is someone who specializes in understanding shade from sun and found 50 different varieties of shade. So she called it 50 grays of shade. I think you were trying on 50 grays of wellness, and you integrated them very nicely. Some of them were more easily grasped. Some of them were more popular. Some of them came along with disciplines that people could administer, like biofeedback or massage. But this idea of peak performance, inspired me 2 decades later to start the Institute for Health and Productivity Management, where I saw the link between health and productivity and performance in the workplace of people who were at an optimal state of health.
And then you went on to do your program at FEI.
Right. Well, our Federal Executive Institute program started like Miller Avenue with nothing. We just had a group of 80 executives who were spending 4 weeks in an intense training center. They were away from their families. They were there at night. They were there on weekends. And I was invited as a newly arriving resident of Charlottesville to give an occasional lecture to those executives. And they were hungry to know how they could improve their health. They were away from their usual bad habits and bad influencers. And so from that, we gradually, over many years, developed an executive wellness program that included extensive health screening, a health risk appraisal, personal health coaching for each individual, an opportunity to meet with a stress management expert, to talk with a nutritionist, daily activities, group exercise activities, all of the food in the cafeteria being marked in terms of its nutritional value, and a whole series of lectures that I and other people gave during prime time. So sort of like you at Miller Avenue, we just started experimenting with what would work with these executives who were in camp for 4 weeks, and they loved it. They absolutely loved being able to concentrate on improving their health. And as a result, it was the most popular part of the executive training program, which really upset a lot of the other teachers. But people would recruit others to come to FEI because they knew that in a month they could dramatically improve their health, lose 10 pounds, lower their blood pressure, lower their cholesterol, and really, really tune themselves up. So that was sort of an offshoot of your innovation with the center in Mill Valley.
How many thousands did you reach that way? Do you know the numbers?
over almost 30 years, we had health risk assessments on 18,000 senior level executives, each one managing a budget of hundreds of millions of dollars.
And they all came through the 4-week program?
Right.
18,000.
It's
Wow.
sort of like the military. You know, to become a general, you have to go to the General Staff College, the Air Force or Navy War College. And for the non-federal executives, I mean, the non-military executives, going to FEI was sort of like going to the place where you could qualify to become a member of the senior executive service, the SES. So 18,000 people came through our program, and we personally counseled 18,000 people on their health.
Wow, I had no idea the size of it. I sat in on some lectures and was aware of it over those years, but I'm in awe. Wow. So, yeah. And you mentioned the health risk appraisal. I want to go off onto that tangent because that's another commonality that we didn't even know we had. As I was struggling in my residency to figure out what I was going to do, the first year was a master's in public health, and that was pretty boring and gave me a lot of time to read. And that's when I stumbled on Dunn's book, and then found the amazing How to Practice Prospective Medicine spiral bound book of Louis Robbins. And my boss at the Health Services Research Unit that I was also a part of while I was a resident at the Public Health Service Hospital in Baltimore, he connected me with Robbins, and I decided to, when I went out to Indiana and saw, this is where Robbins and Hall were at the Methodist Hospital, how they were doing these health, they called it the health hazard appraisal in those days. They were running them off on big desk calculators, you know, those monster machines half the size of a typewriter. And then they would take the numbers and draw a bar graph with colored magic markers and mail it back to people.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, we had three 1700, CDC 1700 computers that each had 16 kilobytes of memory. And I thought, well, we could computerize this thing. And there actually had been a company in San Diego that had computerized it, but their output was a big jumble of numbers and very hard to read. And I liked how Robbins was doing this bar graph. So I made up the bar graph using a line printer and had a hotshot programmer program it for us. And then we'd get occasional inquiries. We'd send them one of those big reels of tape from the old computer tape machines. And we just gave it out freely. It was part of the public domain. And then after I left the Public Health Service, and I tried to interest Hopkins in it, they weren't interested. They had a community clinic in Columbia, Maryland. Thought it would be an ideal place to try it out, but no. And then, that's what led to my doing the wellness inventory, because I saw how we could scare people with the health hazard appraisal, but it didn't change behavior. So I developed the questions that looked at the underlying issues, the beliefs and attitudes that led to the behaviors, and really went off into doing the wellness inventory. Meanwhile, you got involved with what became the HRA, and fill us in on that, because you pretty much picked it up where I left off, I think.
Well, it's true. You were the pioneer in that area as well as so many others. I met Louis Robbins when I came to the American College of Preventive Medicine. He was a member. Was a very proud fellow of the American College of Preventive Medicine. And he had started the Society of Prospective Medicine, but he really wanted to be embraced and recognized and acknowledged by the formal body of doctors in the world of public health and preventive medicine. So he came to me and he said, let me tell you what I'm doing. And like all of our members, I was very interested in what he was up to. And then he said, can I invite you to come to one of the meetings of the Society of Prospective Medicine? And I thought that was very kind and flattering. And then he said, can I get you to speak at the end of the meeting? And can you give a summation of the meeting? Now that was very clever. That meant I not only had to go, but I had to pay attention. I had to take notes, and I had to synthesize the whole thing and do it quickly enough that I could speak on the final morning before the conference broke up. So he taught me a lot about organizational effectiveness. And the way to build an effective organization is to invite a large number of people to come and speak at a meeting. And then they're all there, motivated by their own presentations. They pay attention to each other's. And you have 30, 50 people already going into promoting the event. So I found it very fascinating to learn about the attempt to create scientifically valid measures of calculating people's individual risks, assuming that their risks as an individual were similar to those of people with the same age and sex and risk. But public health statisticians and biometricians had not accepted that. So one of the things that we got started was that we got money from the Centers for Disease Control to hope to fund a research project, and it was chaired by Lester Breslow, the dean of the School of Public Health at UCLA. And Lester Breslow, his statistician, Dr. Afifi, some people from the University of North Carolina in Chapel Hill, some tool makers from General Health in Washington, D.C., and I were all principals in this 3-year project to look at the epidemiology of risk and to come up with statistically valid ways of calculating risk. And this risk factor update project essentially validated health hazard appraisal, or what we then called health risk appraisal, and it led to the creation of dozens of privately funded health risk assessment instruments. There was a public domain one that was funded by the Centers for Disease Control. It wasn't as sophisticated as some of the others, but it was sort of the minimal baseline. But then there were a variety of increasingly sophisticated ways of assessing risk. Now, of course, that's the difference between risk and wellness. You know, you have always focused on the positive side of health, and we were looking at risk. And you would often criticize risk appraisal as having nothing to do with wellness. I think they kind of met at the middle.
Oh yeah, no, I never said that, it was a doorway into it. And we used to do them parallel. I did an HRA and a wellness inventory in my wellness assessment. But by itself, you could scare people, but it didn't change behavior. So it was definitely the doorway into it. Now, was the one that eventually became the Carter Center, did that come out of, I thought that it had originated through the tape that we'd sent out to a bunch of people that Elliot had programmed.
It certainly got started. The CDC had a CDC HRA based on the tape that you created. After the risk factor update project, the Carter Center, President Jimmy Carter Center, then they funded the development of a Carter Center HRA, which was a significant update to what you had developed. And that incorporated the new statistical formulas and calculations and algorithms.
Yeah, the original data, they called it the Gesner-Gellner table. It was a couple of actuarials in Indianapolis. And I remember spending hours on the phone with them, figuring out how to get them into the computer program and trying things out. But well, I didn't know that you'd spoken at an SPM meeting. Which was it, in Indianapolis?
No, it was at the hotel in St. Petersburg, Florida, the giant Pink Hotel. Uh,
Ah,
and they had several meetings there. And of course, after I went to the first one, I went to many of the Society of Prospective Medicine meetings. I spoke at probably a dozen of their conferences. And ultimately, you and I teamed up to be the co-editors of a directory or a handbook of health risk appraisals. I was doing a handbook of health risk appraisals. And then when you joined me, we expanded it to be a handbook of health assessment tools. And so it went beyond health risk appraisal and included a large number of other health assessment tools. Remember
50
that?
authors I had to coordinate. Just to give a little context here, on the personal level, we had reconnected and in the 80s. I'd moved to Costa Rica after I closed the center in 80 and then came back to California. And you were in New York and then in Charlottesville. And we had just moved up to Mendocino on a 40-acre spread, but my wife wasn't happy with it there. And we were talking about community, intentional community, and you and your wife were similarly interested. And anyway, we wound up picking up from California and moving to Charlottesville. And because of you, which our shared interest in community, which is a major ingredient in any wellness program, is the nuclear family just doesn't cut it for raising kids or for growing old or a number of human functions. So it was when I first arrived in Charlottesville that we took on this project, and you got me to coordinate 50 different authors to with an early version of Microsoft Word, where I'd learned about track changes, and boy, that was something. And I remember what was about 2 a.m. we were staying up at the
We stayed at the Knights Inn in order to mail off the final printout of our manuscript to go to Sewickley, Pennsylvania, where it was going to be published.
Yeah, we in those days laser printers were too expensive, so we had to go to Kinko's to print it. That's where we were busy, and we actually got down to cutting and pasting it. We got so desperate, putting graphics in, primitive
Again,
stuff.
this was very cutting edge technology at the time. Authors were used to writing papers, mailing them in hard copy print in the mail, and then the editor had to go through the editing of a hard copy version, and ultimately the printer and publisher had to typeset the whole thing. And you had this radical idea of telling every group that submitted a chapter or an organization that had a tool that they had to submit it electronically. And you gave them a template and a format, asked them to fill it in using Word, and then send it back to you electronically. And that was just shocking. It was stunning. People said, there's no way I can do that. So you ended up coaching dozens of organizations how to provide an electronic submission. You know, looking back on it, everybody submits their proposals for presentations at almost any meeting now to what are called conference harvesters, where they submit their proposal, they get approved or rejected, they then submit their bios, their photos, their abstracts, their questions and answers, their references, their slides. I mean, everything is electronic. But at that point, you were introducing a radical innovation, and people objected strongly to it.
Well, you probably got more flack than I did. There was the table in the back half of the book, but then there were the articles that people had written, some of whom had pretty good spelling and grammar skills. Spell checkers were pretty new at that point. And thank heavens my neighbor had told me about Microsoft Word's track changes facility, which made it possible to edit and send it back. But I had to train about half of them how to use it. So yeah, that was an exercise, and we published the book. It's you can still get copies on Amazon at this recording anyway, and that was quite a project.
Major accomplishment.
And then moving into another completely different area.
Can we take a moment's break? I need to turn the air conditioning on. I'm burning up.
And part 2.
Thank you. This was you're a lifesaver.
Well, it was around this same time that I read the continuum concept. Actually, it's a little earlier, and decided to change my career from adult wellness to infant wellness. It occurred over a period of several years, which included deciding to have a child 21 years after my first daughter was born. And when I met Suzanne Arms, who will also be interviewed soon, we were at the Mother Friendly Childbirth Initiative conference in Madonna Center in California, where all of the childbirth organizations that were proposing better ways than standard medicalized childbirth, Lamaze and Bradley and all them, had gotten together to see if they could produce a document that would incorporate everybody's thinking. And they did. And that's where I met Suzanne Arms. And we, in a hot tub one night, said, wouldn't it be great to go farther than just birth, but deal with what was being called attachment parenting and the preconception work of the American pre and postnatal psychology and health, APA. And it took 2 or 3 years. I know when I first moved to Virginia, I was facilitating a listserv where we were bringing people together. And then I had the radical idea of getting a bunch of people physically together at the Acorn Inn, and you being the solid rock of experience and skilled people's talents, I dragged you in sort of kicking and screaming. Like you said, I don't know anything about this. Well, you actually did, because you'd raised 2 kids with those principles, but you didn't know what they were necessarily. And we had the founding meeting of the Alliance for Transforming the Lives of Children. So
well, I
say a few words about that.
I remember you did ask me to come and help facilitate the meeting of very, very interesting leaders who, some of whom knew each other, but most of whom did not. I do remember that at the first meeting, there were 2 questions that were raised. The first is, could the world's experts agree on basic principles of how to give a newborn child an optimal start in life, starting before conception, intrautero, during birth, and throughout the first few years of life. So the question was, could the experts agree with each other? If so, that would have been astounding. And was there evidence that could actually back up, in terms of evidence-based science, what these optimal ways of bringing up children were? And then the second question that came up at the same meeting was, could the different disparate organizations, each of whom had a stake in this, work together and form an alliance and be more powerful working together than each going off in their own separate way? So we posed those 2 questions at that first meeting, not knowing the answer to either one. And it took several years to move toward proving that, yes, amazingly, the experts could agree. And of course, that led to the publication of the blueprint for transforming the lives of children, which had, I think, about 100 basic principles that we believed represented a solid grounding for optimal health in babies and birthing. And then you diligently pursued dozens, maybe even hundreds of organizations and got them to sign on as members of the Alliance or as individuals, as members of the Board of Advisors. And we held, after our years of meeting to develop our basic documents, we held 2 summit conferences where we could disseminate and promote what we had come up with and engage audiences of hundreds to go forward. So, this all began with this one meeting, and you did just ask me to come to one meeting, facilitate the group conversation, and somehow I got hooked, and I stayed with it, and to this day I'm president of the Alliance.
Yeah, that was quite an event, and I'm just thinking of the people that were there. Sharon Humanick, who's since died, but we actually have a wonderful interview that you did with her that is part of this series on the pier, the little pond near where she was living in outside Richmond. And Suzanne was there. No, Suzanne wasn't at the first meeting. I think Ray was there.
Pam Leo was there.
Pam Leo. And I'm interviewing her. Had the Sweets, I don't think they were there. Lisa and Barbara Nichols from APA, or no, APA. I'm confusing it with APA. American Attachment Parenting International, API, yes. They were there.
Go back and repeat that sentence so you don't have to edit in the middle of the sentence. So who else was there?
Well, those are the
Barbara and who?
Lisa, forgotten her last name, Nichols, I think. They didn't stay with us, but they developed a lot more themselves, and they're kind of a parallel organization that we've had dealings with. And yeah, there were over 100 affiliates and advisors in the initial gathering of the Alliance. I spent about 5 years on that project. We actually, with Sharon's help, because she was chair of the maternal child health department at VMI's nursing school in Richmond, she got her graduate students, nursing students who had a research class, to take the individual points of the blueprint and research them. And about half of them were significantly documented, which she then published in the journal that she was editing. And we linked them online. They're still there on the website, which amazed me. I didn't think we could find that much science to support them. We knew this was ancient wisdom and common knowledge, but it hadn't necessarily been scientifically studied, I thought, but we found a good bit of it. Then we did those summits. That was Suzanne's idea, and brought together people from all different disciplines that had not been cross-fertilized before, and they were brilliant. However, the finances of them was too much. We had so much volunteer labor that we burned out. And then we revived the Alliance about 5 years ago with a bequest that we got, and that's more history that we'll get to later. So, yeah, so you've been my sidekick, or vice versa, on a lot of projects.
That's true. We have had a lot of fun collaborating on projects that were challenging conventional thinking, that were advancing our social ideals. that were sometimes challenging to implement technically, and that people did not readily immediately recognize. But I'm sure you must be very satisfied to see that over the years, so many of the things that you started and that we worked on became mainstays. You know, wellness is a household word that's misused every day by millions of people. Health risk appraisals are the most popular of the health promotion programs in corporate industry for employee health. And more and more groups are forming to try to help parents become more skillful. And so I think, we have seen a steady and slow but progressive social movement in these areas that we've been discussing.
Yeah, wow. It's been a journey. I want to shift to another aspect of it in in terms of the wellness center that we started in Mill Valley and how that then has impacted yours and my work and other things going forward. But when I started, I thought it was going to be me and Linda Berkeley, who was a biofeedback technician that I got part-time to work. And we shared a secretary with the owner of the building. There were 9 offices in 42 Miller Building, and we had 2 of them. And then I met Don Ardell, who was also interviewed, and suddenly got all this national exposure, and things grew, and we had people coming from all over. And I met Ken Maui, a very intense PhD in music, but he was interested in the Bates method of healing myopia. And did you ever meet Ken? Probably not.
Oh.
Very eccentric fellow, and we lost track of him. He disappeared into Newfoundland actually at one point, and haven't been seen since. But he and I hit it off, and then it was through his idea that we should expand further and hire a secretary for me, and he then screened like 20, mostly women, and picked Bobby. And she had been working for a music school in Sausalito that had folded or something. And someone I would never have run into. She was very much self-taught. She'd had a few years at Chico State. And when I found out she knew more nutrition than I did, I gave her some clinical responsibilities. Eventually, she became the coordinator of client services. We had, there was Joy Holloway, who I brought in from the beginning. She was doing clearing counseling, and David Isaacs, who also was trained in that. And we started having friction, like mainly because of my being a tall white male with a master's in domination degree, and also feeling burned out in that I was responsible for the payrolls, and it was a struggle each month. And it was Ken who had the idea to hire a family therapist from up in Fairfax, who came in, and he did a family sculpting thing with us, where we arranged ourselves physically and how we saw the relationships among us. And I think at that point, Annie Styron had joined us too. She later married George Leonard, who was very supportive. He was on our board of advisors, and he had interviewed me for the New West magazine. So we had this sort of family, and it was clear that it was a hierarchical, patriarchal thing, with me being the patriarch. And I wasn't very good at management. And so with these meetings that we had with the family therapist, we developed a lot of communication skills that we then proceeded to do on our own. Every Friday, we'd had business meetings on Monday mornings that often would take all morning. You know, they would be talking about the clients and what was going on, and there would be friction, and it was frustrating. So on Friday afternoons, I contributed an hour of work time, and they contributed an hour of volunteer time. So we had 2-hour family meetings Friday afternoons where we cleared stuff. We learned how to get along with each other, and it was amazing. And often we'd go out to dinner together. The Monday morning meetings were transformed because we were clear with each other, and we had this sense of family, and the meetings just zipped right through. So it was that sense of family and connection that I saw as crucial to the ongoing function of our center. And even with that, because of the cost of overhead and so forth, they eventually did close it. But we started doing these seminars like the one you came to and then participated in. And people would have amazing senses of community and open up, and it was, you know, transformative. Then they'd go home and crash and burn. Meanwhile, I had pretty much crashed and burned in 1980. I had staff of 13 at one point. And we moved to Costa Rica to live in a Quaker settlement of North Americans up in Monteverde and go back to the land. And well, that was another whole experience. It's a lot harder to be self-supporting than I had any idea. And then came back, and around that time is when you initiated the Metadocs gathering, another kind of community that we had tried to do in '79, I think, at Elliot's place, but you really made it happen at Seven Oaks. And there were 8 of us, 9 of us in the original gathering.
Right. Interesting because everyone knew 1 or 2 or 3 other people, but nobody had more than just a small handful of colleagues who were challenging the conventional wisdom, that were interested in health and wellness, and were wanting to do innovative things. And we all felt like black sheep in our own communities, and we really needed kindred spirits.
We were between orthodox and paradox that's why we chose the name Metadocs.
Right. So we met at a retreat center north of Charlottesville. And the one ground rule at our first meeting was that as physicians, I think there may have been 10 of us at the first meeting, the one thing we could not talk about was our work. You know, we could not hide behind our masks and hide behind what we did. We came together with that one ground rule. So the thing we had most in common, we couldn't talk about. And so we were this very fidgety group of people trying to learn how to connect, how to bond, how to form a group, and not knowing how to do it. So we were very awkward. We tried hikes, and that worked with nature. We tried volleyball, and that failed because some people were very competitive and other people weren't competitive at all. We tried singing and chanting, and that worked. But the thing that really worked, and I think gelled our first meeting, was when each of us took turns and spent about a half an hour just sharing something about our origins and our lives, our personal lives, and what we were looking for in life. And that was so rich that at the end of that meeting, everybody said, let's get together again. And so we agreed to meet 6 months later at the same place, at the Seven Oaks Retreat Center in Madison, Virginia. And it was at that meeting that I think I radically proposed that we actually get together twice a year for 20 years. And people said I was certifiably insane and that was completely nuts. But by the end of that meeting, we had a name of Metadocs, physicians in transition from orthodox in pursuit of the great paradox. So we were metaphysicians or Metadocs. So we had a name, we had an agreement for the next three meetings of who would chair them and coordinate them. And we kept to our original mantra of twice a year for 20 years. Now, it's
And it was
true.
3 days at a meeting. The meetings were more than just a weekend.
Yeah, yeah. We'd meet on a Thursday night and leave on a Sunday. So they were long enough to be truly intimate and truly intense. So that began a very fascinating journey of one group of physicians. There were women invited to the first three meetings, and for whatever reason, they did not at the last minute come. So it was not intended to be a men's group, but it ended up being a men's group. And we finally all accepted that that's what it is. Although in later years, we've invited our spouses and significant others to join some of our meetings, not everyone, but occasionally we'll have the family gathering, and that has also enriched it even further.
Yeah, this is all amplifying what I think is lost in modern day views of wellness is the community, the connection, and my saying of the currency of wellness is connection. And yours and my personal connection is has been a thread for us, and Metadocs wouldn't have happened if what the original idea occurred in my hotel room in Richmond when I was invited to give a presentation for the I think it was through the school system for professionals doing maybe it was school nurses or something like that. And I had invited Marty and Sam Corin, for those of you who are just joining us, another physician in Charlottesville that practices in the same building where Kent's sitting right now. And he and Marty had a medical practice that they had originally called the Charlottesville Wellness Center. Not quite the same as my idea of wellness, but that's the name of your whole building now. And Elliot Dasher was there, and you weren't though, Kent. I don't think. It was later. It was through Marty, and I was astounded that I was with four physicians who all shared this commonality, and we thought, wouldn't it be a great idea to meet together as physicians? And we actually did some singing together. That's the same thing that we've continued to do for 30 some years. And we had planned a meeting then for later that year, but it didn't happen. And then you pulled it together, as you are so good at doing. And we had the first meeting, was 83, 84?
84, April of 84.
Yeah. So that means it's in 35 years running now.
Yep.
And,
well, Elliot Dasher once said, I was the member of the group who had the lowest tolerance for ambiguity. So that meant I was the one who was trying to organize the group and make commitments as to when we were going to meet, where we were going to meet, who was going to co-chair the meetings, how we could handle our finances, et cetera, et cetera.
Write up the history and keep the log sheet, the contact sheet up to date. Well, it's interesting how yet another thread during our first summit, I was rooming with my friend Skip, who had also been to a Metadocs meeting, and he told me about this thing called the Mankind Project and the New Warriors adventure training, which I'd heard of, but warriors, men running around in the woods beating their chests, it didn't grab me. And he said, well, I hated it, and I almost left, but 6 months later, I noticed my life had changed. And so I wound up doing it the next year. And what interested me was they had regular groups called integration or I groups that was what I was looking for, both living in Australia at that point, most of the year, and then discovered that there was, because I'd lived in Shannon Farm community outside Charlottesville, before moving to Australia, and this was in the late 90s, that men who I had known and not particularly liked at Shannon Farm had since, while I was in Australia, done the New Warriors training and started an I group in Virginia at the house of a friend of ours, a mutual friend. So I went to one of them and I came home. We were staying with you, I think, and told you about it. And now you're the primary instigator of that group. So
I don't know that I'm the primary instigator, but the group is now 20 years old, and I've been meeting with the group for well over 10 years. So I'm one of the old farts. I guess they call us elders.
Yeah.
The thing that I like about this is that we have invited younger men to join the group. So it's not just an aging group of people, but there are people, men in their 20s, who are still looking for the ideal relationship. There are men in their 30s who are parents of young children and looking to live and work in community. There are men in their 40s and 50s, all the way up to one man who's in his 80s. So we are able to span multiple generations and not think of ourselves as older and younger, but what we have in common is the human spirit. We all have feelings, and we check in with our feelings. Are we feeling mad, glad, sad, afraid, or ashamed? We each have aspirations. We each have cutting edges, the things we're working on. We're each willing to do emotional process work. We each have a mission that we have learned to speak in animal terms, in MKP terms, and we all have a desire to do community service. So the bonds that have brought us together once a week, every single week, people meeting for 2 hours to share their lives on an ongoing basis, these bonds have become very powerful and very strong. And if any one of the people in our group has a problem, needs help, needs assistance, has an illness or a family issue, everyone is there to support them. So we're helping each other grow, and we're helping our community. And once again, Jack, you were the one who brought me into that. And since I'm a pretty good organizer, I am the treasurer of that local group.
And at one point you were doing a lot organizing retreats, and it looked like it was going to flounder there for a while until you got on board, and it's flourished. And another aspect of the Mankind Project, or MKP, is that they address shadow, which I think is the most overlooked aspect of wellness, in that people want everything to be nice and happy and so forth. And the brighter the light, the more intense the shadow. And that organization actually addresses it, which is a rare thing. As well as, you've mentioned the Seven Oaks Retreat Center, but we haven't mentioned Pathwork, which is another commonality that, thanks to your ex-wife, you and I both went to a weekend with Donovan and Alegria. What was that, in about 97, 98, and then you got heavily involved, and we both did. I did part of the transformation program, and they address shadow. Those are the only two national organizations I know of that openly address shadow. And again, Charlottesville's a center for that kind of thing. I've been to a lot of other I groups, and none of them have I found anywhere close to the intimacy of the Virginia I group that I still go to every year when I'm out there for the couple of weeks that I come and reconnect with you and Pat.
Well, I think probably everyone who's watching this video participates in groups. And I know when I'm about to go to a meeting, particularly if it's inconvenient to get there, I ask myself, do I really want to do this? Why am I going? Is it worth it? And what I keep finding over and over again is that, yes, it is worth it. I leave my every Monday night I group meeting so grateful that I got to connect with other men and share at a real, honest level our lives as they progress. You know, I'm grateful at the end of every Metadocs meeting that we have twice a year that I traveled across the country and went to that meeting. And I've been grateful for every one of the workshops that you've given or conferences we've sponsored and put a lot of effort into. And at the end, I'm grateful. So I could have sat back and done much less, but every time I put myself out, step forward, lean into an issue or a challenge or a problem, I'm always rewarded, and it keeps me going.
Yeah. I want to jump backwards historically a little bit. You reminded me that we also used the rule that you couldn't talk about your profession the first 2 days of our workshops. We did let them eventually do that because a lot of people had commonalities and wanted to connect, and they were all strangers. But as I said, we noticed that people would crash and burn after that. We had week-long intensives. We had 2 days followed by an optional 2 days, the ones that you came to. And when I came back from Costa Rica, and Maren and I wanted to start a network to connect people beyond the meetings that would allow, and she'd gotten involved in feminist spirituality, and I began to see what patriarchy was, and my white male privilege and my master's in domination degree, how that was both a added respectability, and I got listened to, but it also was a barrier. It was a barrier in doing wellness assessments because people kept thinking I was going to pull a magic wand out of my drawer and make them better. And eventually Bobby wound up doing the wellness assessments because she didn't have a medical degree and they didn't have that expectation, and it worked better. But anyway, we started what became known as the Wellness Associates Network with helping professionals, where they came for a weekend and got a lot of partnership skills. Just the concept. We used Starhawk's Truth or Dare book as our textbook to recognize how the medical system is very hierarchical, patriarchal, dominator oriented. And I knew from having been a medical student and intern, and the pecking order that occurs, how frustrating that is. And many of the people were frustrated. We'd seen that for years. And we gave them tools to go back to wherever they were and start their own groups and have people come for these trainings. Then we had advanced weekends where we would bring people together to continue it. And that was exciting. It eventually ended because I then moved into infant wellness, and we had a child, and it became more and more difficult. But the emphasis on community and the loss of the village, both from our own well-being and the effect that it has on kids. It's the work I'm doing still. And you've got Kate White half a mile away from you, who's been working with APA. Maybe we'll get her interviewed too. This theme, I think, is central to what real wellness is, and I can't say enough about it. Personally, I've been part of a group in Australia that meets. I can't get us to meet more than every other week, but we did psychodrama and co-counseling and Gestalt, and then eventually, just because we're all involved in some form of counseling, we just meet to be people with each other, and it's become a very important family thing, like the Metadocs is, only these are people that are local. And then Bill Kauth, who is the co-founder of the Mankind Project and the New Warriors Training, shifted into what he calls the New Tribe Training and wrote a book called We Need Each Other. And Yvonne and I got interested in, could we create a community here in this wonderful community that we moved into in Novato? retirement community with already a lot of activities going on. But could we find people that would be willing to process, as you and I have, Kent, through the I group, to look at our shadow and to be within a bike ride of the people you want to bury you, was the definition that Bill Couth used. And I lived in 6 different communities, 4 of them intentional and 2 of them unintentional. And the frustrations of when you're sharing property together, and the limitations of that. So the idea of a community that's not quite as intense, but still family. And we've succeeded in getting 9 people together here that meet again every other week, and for 2.5 years. So this theme of community and village is just, to me, all important and virtually ignored in the conventional wellness world. It drew us to Virginia with you guys. We were originally going to start the community with you and Jenny, but yeah, that's my wrap on community.
I would just say that when people ask me to tell them about my life, I very often start by saying I have the good fortune of living in many intimate circles. I have the intimate circle of our local I group. I have the intimate circle of the people that I work with in a Charlottesville Wellness Center building, and we've been friends now for 35 years. I have the intimate circle of the Metadocs men's group. I have the intimate circle of work of meeting regularly with Pathwork Helpers, which is a spiritual school that I've been a part of for 30 years. And so people say they have this longing to connect just with one other person. And I feel like I have this whole series of intimate circles that I belong to. Another one we haven't talked about is the Alliance for Transforming the Lives of Children. There's a regular monthly telephone call with people from throughout the world, New Zealand and Australia included. And we operate really as a support group to each other in the pioneering efforts that people make. And I think it's this sense of connecting, of being real, of sharing deeply, of being willing to share shadow and to do process work and to lean into issues when they come up between people, and truly connecting on a regular basis. It can't happen, once a year at annual meetings. It has to be part of an ongoing series of connections. So my life is just enormously rich because of the intimate circles that I'm a part of.
Yeah, you've got a few others like what's the name of your occupational medicine group, named for that guy? You know what I mean?
Well, that's right. I'm part of the Bernardino Ramazzini Society.
Right.
31 living experts in occupational environmental medicine. I have colleagues that I teach with through the American College of Occupational Medicine that I've been teaching the same course for 30 years, only it changes every year, on drug and alcohol testing in the workplace. And I wouldn't pass up the intimate circle of children. Becoming friends with my children as they have gone through their life cycle and being able to share their lives and be a friend, not a parent, but just a friend, has been enormously rewarding to me.
Oh, and there's one other one that you go to every spring out in Kansas that you've been very instrumental in keeping that going.
Well, that's my battery. That's my spiritual battery charger. The Council Grove, Kansas conference that meets every year the week after Easter and is devoted to bringing together researchers advancing the research on human consciousness. They've been meeting for over 50 years, and they've brought together pioneers in a safe setting where no photos are taken, no recordings are taken, and people can just truly share their cutting edges about their personal consciousness and their research on consciousness. That's where I've met some of the most extraordinary people in my life.
Yeah. What a rich tapestry. So, well, I think we're wrapping up here. This has been quite a trip.
Well, I think this is a great preliminary conversation. I think I can clean up my office a little more and get a little camera where I can actually be looking into it. And we could do this again and make it prime time. But I'm delighted to have spent the time with you. I love you deeply. And you're just an amazing dialoguer in front of a camera. I really admire you.
Well, our bond is definitely central to my professional life and my personal life. Oh, I didn't mention another thing that's related to this is that Yvonne and I go out to Virginia for about 2 weeks every summer to be with you and Pat. And almost daily we have check-ins and meetings and deal with our shadows. And Kent is someone that can trigger my shadow better than almost anyone else I know, and vice versa. So I think we were twins separated at birth in terms of we have so much in common that we both love and sometimes get triggered by. And we even monthly do a Skype call where
Couples coaching.
Of coaching, yeah, couples coaching. So there's so many different ways to that wellness can manifest in the personal aspect of it. So I think we probably got about 4 or 5 different recordings here if we edit them. And thank you again for so much.